Welcome to this week's assignment in the ILSSO course, Part 1 of Cultural Values. You may be curious as to why we're talking about cultural values as part of this course. When President George H.W. Bush visited Japan late in his presidency, he attempted to raise the profile of the trip by bringing along American business leaders who would echo his demands for better trade agreements between the United States and Japan. His plan, however, backfired when such direct comments violated Japanese etiquette. To the Japanese people, it is considered rude, ignorant, and even desperate to make such direct demands. Many believe that this cultural misstep severely damaged the negotiations. Had the president's advisors considered the values of Japanese culture, the outcome could have been very different. This week, we'll begin a 2-week focus on cultural values, so as to avoid similar situations on ILSSO. As ambassadors for FFA, American agriculture, and the United States, we want to ensure that any headlines we create are for the right reasons, rather than the wrong reasons. Earlier in this course, we defined culture as a way of describing how and why people do what they do. As we continue to think about culture this week, let's bear this definition in mind. Let's also remember that we know that cultures vary across the globe, across nations, across communities, across college campuses, across generations, and across organizations. As you work on this week's demonstrate assignment after viewing this recording, you would do well to remember that cultural differences need not require a passport or differing nationalities. We can experience a cultural shift and a shift in cultural values without requiring an international presence. Let's start by defining cultural values. Much research has been conducted regarding cultural values and the many ways that cultures differ. Some of the most famous research comes from a Dutch professor by the name of Hofstede. His research on cultural dimensions forms the basis for much of the research that follows, including that of David Livermore, author of the Cultural Intelligence Assessment that we'll take in the final weeks of this course. Livermore has a talent for breaking down the research around culture and putting it into everyday terms. Just as I'm a fan of his definition for culture, I'm a fan of the simple way he defines cultural values. Society's ideas about what is good, right, fair, and just. What is meant by society? Well, society differs as cultures differ. The culture in your high school or college campus may look different than that of your rival school. That said, the society or population of that culture may look pretty different. The same goes for subcultures. Chances are that differences between students and faculty on your campus could represent two subcultures, the society of each having very different sets of values. For the purposes of ILSSO, we'll investigate 7 cultural dimensions over the next 2 weeks. This week, we'll focus on power distance, context, and uncertainty avoidance, while next week, we'll tackle the remaining 4. Each of these dimensions represents a spectrum, which can be represented as a single line extending from the center in 2 opposite directions. Dimensions tend to have 2 extremes, which fall on either side of the spectrum. Cultures tend to fall somewhere on the line, with one culture being relative to another. When you complete the required cultural intelligence assessment for this course, you'll learn where your personal preference falls in each of these cultural values spectrums. As you learn about each value dimension, make a guess as to where you think you personally fall, as an individual, on each continuum line. We'll begin our first values dimension with power distance. Power distance is the extent to which differences in power and status are expected or accepted. Low power distance cultures diminish the significance of formal titles and roles, whereas high power distance cultures think titles and clear authority are important indicators of how to relate and behave. Imagine a flowchart that shows hierarchy. If the flowchart had many different levels, it is likely showing you a high power distance culture. On the other hand, if the flowchart were flat, meaning that it has very few levels of hierarchy, you are likely interacting with a low power distance culture. Power distance can be a challenging obstacle, both cross-culturally and within cultures. Let's take a look at Malcolm Gladwell, author of the book Outliers, explain one such challenge in this interview.
Malcolm, when you talk about what succeeds, some of what you talk about in terms of success and failure is not just the individuals, because as you say, that doesn't seem dominant. It's the environment around them, the culture around them, and some cultures, I mean national cultures, seem better and worse.
Yeah.
You found that by and large, Koreans were very bad at being pilots. Explain
that. Being a good pilot, we think, is a matter of technical skill. It isn't, really.
But what about Sully Sullenberger?
Well, he's such an outlier to the theory of outliers. That's a very rare kind of plane crash. In fact, I don't know if there'd ever been a successful water landing in the last 50 years. Most crashes have a very different form. The overwhelming majority of crashes are the result of a breakdown in communication between the co-pilot and the pilot. Something comes up, a situation emerges that requires those two pilots to be in open and honest communication, and they fail to do that. One person withholds information, one person doesn't share, whatever. They're invariably social failures. So the question is, this is why there's a cultural component. Is it easier in some cultures for a subordinate to speak openly and honestly to his superior than in other cultures? And the answer is absolutely. In fact, this is one of the dimensions on which cultures vary the most. It's called power distance, right? It is the respect for hierarchy. And there are some cultures that have zero respect for hierarchy, and some cultures that are, for which that is the dominant paradigm of social interaction. Korea, as it happens, is a culture which has enormous respect for hierarchy, where power distance is in fact, the entire linguistic structure of the Korean language is infused with this sense of, how do I treat you if you are older and superior to me? I use specific pronounal forms. I mean, it goes on and on and on, right? Well, that is in 99% of cases, a beautiful and wonderful thing. In the cockpit, it's a problem, right? And so you see, whenever you see cultures, if you overlay the list of cultures in the world by their respect for power distance with the list of cultures in the world by their plane crashes per capita, it's basically the same list.
So it's the ones that are hierarchical that have the most plane crashes.
That have the most plane crashes. So you'll see, so classic, you know.
And what did Korean Airlines do?
Well, this is the second part of this argument, which is, this is not to say that certain cultures are incapable of doing that task. It just means that if they want to get better, they have to address the cultural component of their interaction. And that's exactly what Korean Air did. And they fixed their problem. Today, Korean Air was, through the 90s, one of the most dangerous airlines in the world. I mean, it was almost shut down at the end of the 90s by international aviation authorities. The Canadians told them at one point, you can't fly over Canada anymore. I mean, which is a real problem if you're trying to get from one end of the world to the other. And they fixed it. And they fixed it by bringing in people who have a different cultural attitude and essentially re-educating the pilots in Korean Airlines.
And they made them speak in English because they said it's a non-hierarchical language.
It's a non-hierarchical language. They wanted to think like, you know, I mean, non-hierarchical cultures are America, Israel, Austria, Australia. They wanted them to think like Australians, essentially, right? What do? Well, you make them speak English, right? And it works. I mean, this is the sort of hopeful lesson at the core of my book, which is that when we acknowledge how much of success is embedded in culture, that's a hopeful thing because culture is malleable. It's something we can address if we put our minds to it.
Think about Gladwell's last line. Culture is malleable, he says. It's something that we can address if we put our minds to it. As we learn about these cultural values, let's not lose sight of the fact that these values are not absolute. It doesn't have to become a matter of getting our way, losing our cultural identity, or making someone else lose theirs. Instead, we learn about these values with the intent of understanding one another, so that we can better find ways to cooperate, or at the very least, coexist. That said, let's look at our second values dimension. Generally speaking, there is one place that needs to appeal to most cultures more than anywhere else: international airports. If you've never flown into or out of an airport's international terminal, pay special attention when we fly out of Dulles in January. You're likely to see signs like these in every direction. That's because cultures vary immensely in terms of how much information is necessary to express meaning and get the point across. We call this cultural dimension context. Context is the extent to which communication is direct and emphasizes roles and implicit understanding. Low context cultures will usually post a lot of signs and directions. They'll emphasize very direct and thorough communication. High context cultures presume individuals know how to get along more intuitively and determine such explicit communication to be unnecessary. In the intro to this lesson, you learned about President Bush's failed approach to negotiating trade deals with Japan. He arrived in country with a number of American business tycoons who were supportive of his demands for open trade. Given what you see before you about context, would you guess that Japan is generally a low context culture or a high context culture? If you said high context culture, you are correct. The Japanese value indirect communication. They saw our president's direct demands to be rude and even desperate. When I think of context, I think back to my first time leading ILSSO through Argentina. Argentines are very proud of their country's 3 claims to fame: soccer, beef, and wine. My first year in country, I had a vegetarian traveling with us. The student was more than willing to be gracious about letting others eat his steak, and to be honest, there were a number of volunteers who were happy to do so. But our guide saw his meal preference ahead of time and was very concerned about the student. Rather than saying, "Can he just leave the meat for someone else to eat?" he was very indirect about the matter, saying, "It will be very difficult to ensure that no beef ends up on his plate." That's a great example of high context communication, very indirect and leaving a lot to be interpreted by the audience. Our third dimension has to do with how a culture handles risk. Uncertainty avoidance is the extent to which risk is reduced or avoided altogether through planning and guidelines. Low uncertainty avoidance cultures have a higher tolerance and comfort level for ambiguity and risk. The focus in these cultures tends to be on flexibility and adaptability. While unstructured and unpredictable situations are not always welcome, they can be tolerated and worked through without much hassle. On the other end, high uncertainty avoidance cultures look for different ways to prevent uncertainty and risk. These cultures focus on planning and reliability. They are extremely uncomfortable in unstructured or unplanned situations. Let's see if you can tell what side of the spectrum Germany is thought to be on based on this car commercial.
It's the level of thought that goes into everything we do that makes Volkswagen, Volkswagen. It's the attention to the littlest details, taking time to sweat the smallest stuff, insisting on only the highest quality materials, engineering more thought into every single part. These are all hallmarks of German engineering. And the reason everyone knows the best cars in the world come from Germany. It's also the reason why most people think a German-engineered car is something they simply can't afford. Isn't it time for a German-engineered car that everyone can afford? For an affordable German-engineered car, that's solidly constructed top to bottom, meticulously crafted inside and out. Isn't it time for an affordable German-engineered car that makes people feel something? With driver assist features typically found on luxury cars. With an engine that's more powerful and miraculously more fuel efficient. Isn't it time for German engineering done the Volkswagen way? You'd better believe it.
It goes without saying, right? Volkswagen is keen to use the phrase German engineering as synonyms for planning and reliability, making the case that their cars are the best on the market. While high uncertainty avoidance may look and sound great when engineering a car, it does have its share of sticking points. Imagine being a U.S. entrepreneur trying to convince German investors that your product will sell in their market. Or better yet, imagine working for the Department of Agriculture and trying to convince Germany to open their market to a particular U.S. commodity. In these cases, we would face intense scrutiny as the nation of Germany tries to manage its risk. Can't you see the importance of being a global citizen and understanding cultural values? As we uncover the remaining 4 dimensions next week, we can't help but seek to use these qualities to better understand the world around us. This week, you'll show what you know by exploring one of these values in your demonstrate assignment. You'll find more information in this week's folder. I can't wait to see what you've come up with. Good luck!